When I was a kid, I'm from Northern California. I'm from Petaluma, butter and eggs capital of the world when I was growing up. And I got placed in sixth grade in an SOI class, special gifted talented kids. And somehow that teacher, Mr. Flinders, thank you, Mr. Flinders, thank you, finagled a way to teach ancient Egypt to that class for a semester. Like a whole semester this man had us. And by the end of that, I decided I want to be an Egyptologist. In all truth, that second half of the year, he taught bridges. And had he reversed it, I might be a civil engineer right now. But that's how I came to it. And I wanted to be an Egyptologist since that age. My family wasn't exactly supportive or on board. My father looked at me and was like, you will be a computer scientist and make money. And I got a job, so it all worked out in the end. But that's how I came to it, and I just always wanted to be it. Always, always, always from that point forward. I haven't found Mr. Flinders. My brother, at one point while I was, I think, at the American University in Cairo as an undergraduate, my brother was serving coffee, and I think he met Mr. Flinders at one point. He's like, you realize Leslie's going to be an Egyptologist because of you. But if Mr. Flinders sees this, thank you, thank you, thank you. As an undergraduate, I went to the University of California at Davis because I didn't get into the University of California at Berkeley. And that was a standing joke for kids at Davis, that we didn't get into Berkeley or UCLA. I hadn't applied to UCLA, but I had really wanted to go to Cal. I had also applied to the University of Chicago, which I did get into, but we didn't have the finances. And I had no understanding as a kid I was raised by two college-educated parents, but they had gone to college while I was in grade school and junior high, and my father had gotten it paid for by his profession, and then my mother got it paid for by hers, and they thought of it as job training. We had no idea how to navigate that whole system, had no idea how to view expense. So it was both the most powerful and the most crushing moment to get that acceptance at a school I really wanted to go to and realize that was just so financially out of our range. So I went to Davis because Davis has a water tower, and if you're Northern Californian, you know this. It's on I-80, and you pass it on the way from Petaluma, where I was raised, to my grandmother's house in Roseville. That is officially all I knew about UC Davis when I applied to it. It had a water tower, and it was close-ish, 70 minutes, an ideal distance from the family, while still being close to the family. And so I went there, and my first whatever they do, freshman orientation, I went in, I'm like, okay, I need to take Egyptology classes, which I know they didn't have. I did not want to go to this school, It's a phenomenal school, I'm very glad I went, but did not want to at first. And so I found anthropology and decided to major over there. I decided freshman year, like that moment before freshman year, because it was a study of culture. I'm like, Egypt is a culture? You study culture? That must be what I'm going to do. And then I also found this study abroad table, and the UC system had then, I think still has, an excellent exchange with the American University in Cairo. And so I held it up, but it's financially the same because I had gotten savvy to college finances by that point. And I'm like, I will be going here. I will be doing this junior year. So I've sort of set up a way to do Egyptology at Davis, which, I mean, it was a fabulous place. The anthropology background, so crucial to my work now, absolutely formative. While I was there, I worked with Dr. Robert Bettinger, who was a Great Basin archaeologist. And if you know the Great Basin, you know it's aceramic. If you know me, you know I study ceramics. So I came back after being in Egypt for a year and a half, ended up taking a Native North America class with Dr. Bettinger, and sat in the front row of his class. And at one point he's like, well, the reason I do the Great Basin and not this or that, and then he looks at me, he's like, or Egypt, is because it doesn't have ceramics. And so here I am, this little budding ceramicist in his class. But then again, Dr. Bettinger's work ended up being pretty formative in my dissertation, where he, as an anthropologist, is doing a lot of theoretical work and was working with volumetric reconstruction at one point in standardization. And so all of that becomes really linchpin for my work. So I look at the anthro degree as foundational. I look at that relationship with Robert Bettinger as incredibly key. I worked with Lisa Dietz at the Anthropology Museum there, which is Native American. They had a huge collection of Northern Californian basketry, and that was foundational as well. I can sing the praises of Davis all day long. I'm really glad I went. I went to the American University in Cairo for 3 semesters while I was at Davis. I did it junior year and part of senior year, and basically came back to Davis to collect my degree and then moved back to Cairo. And while I was at AUC, I worked with Dr. Salima Akram, Dr. Faiza Hakel, and Dr. Zehi Hawass. And all 3 of those figures ended up being so pivotal to the way I thought about Egypt, because the idea of thinking about Egypt outside of Egypt and its Egyptianness, its inherent grounding in its space, became immediately foreign. Like the minute that I'm officially getting training is also the minute that I'm thinking of Egyptian as grounded in Egyptian soil, as Egyptian connected to modern Egyptians. I'm thinking about Arabic. And so that ends up being so key for me. And I think had I not had the anthropology degree at Davis, had I not had the experience at AUC, not only would I not be the scholar I am, but I am not sure I would have been able to move forward into Penn, that I would have gotten a job in the end, and I wouldn't have thought as the sorts of thoughts that I work with now. So for my graduate studies, I went to the University of Pennsylvania. And that came out of very specifically conversations that I was having in Cairo with that body professors, particularly Salim and Zehi, about where I should go. I wanted to be an Old Kingdom scholar, and it was clear I was going to have to move out of Egypt. I wanted to stay in Egypt. I was working for what's now the Ministry of Antiquities. I was working for the Supreme Council of Antiquities during a gap year at the Egyptian Antiquities Information System. I wanted to stay in Egypt, but I needed a PhD to continue in the field. And so after a lot of discussions, I had narrowed down my choices to a few that I would apply to. And the University of Pennsylvania really rose to the top of what I wanted as somebody who was interested in the Old Kingdom, but wasn't going to get it in America, wasn't going to happen, but was really interested in settlement archaeology and looking at the lives of ancient Egyptians. That anthropology degree had really turned me away from being interested in tombs. I didn't want to do the mortuary archaeology thing. You can do that through an anthropological lens, but that was not where my training had been. I really wanted to be a settlement girl. And so that made working with Joe Wagner particularly desirable. So and of course Zehi's an alum, so he's singing the praises of Penn, telling me how great it is. And I sat on pins and needles in an apartment in Zamalek, waiting for official knowledge of where I got in, if I got in at all. But the mail system didn't really deliver me anything because I'm living in Egypt, and it's like I'm not getting mail from America, and so it was a fraught time. In the end, I did get into Penn, and they admitted 2 people my year, which was apparently part of the challenge because they wanted me and they wanted Antonio Morales as well. And we were both coming in the same year, but they had one funding package, and they had to accept people full funding. That's how Penn had just very recently at that time rewritten its requirements. And so, as rumor has it, this is what I have been told by Antonio or Silverman, I don't remember, but Dr. David Silverman went to the administration at Penn to push for a second line and was able to get it. And so he got the 2 of us, and we started the same year. And then at Penn, of course, I worked with Dr. David Silverman, who was doing the philological leg of things, and I became Joe Wagner's student doing the archaeology end of things, and that, of course, ends up being my focus. I'm a pot person. There's many terms for us, ceramicist, pot person, and there aren't very many American ceramicists. It's something that's more broadly trained in Europe, and it's not like there are a lot of European ceramicists either. It's a small cadre of us, and we're all overworked because there's more of this material and not enough people. And so, be a ceramicist. We need more of them. I turned to ceramics because of Dr. Salima Akram, and Salima she's a huge figure, and she looms so large in all of my career in many ways. So I had started working on the North Kharga Oasis survey as an undergraduate while I was at the American University in Cairo, and so I was working on it with Salima. And initially she had all of her little undergrads running around doing surveying. And that's good. Survey is key. And Kharga at that time was unknown, and we didn't have Google Maps. We had to try to wrangle satellite images from whatever wrangling we could do. GIS was being newly employed in Egyptian archaeology, so all of this was really, really new. And then the second year I went out with her, and I've been going out with her since forever. She decided to start cross-training her students so we get different experience in different specialties. Salima's take is always you need a second string on your fiddle, and being trained in a specialty is something she asks her students to do, versus others which train you to be a mudir, but there's not a lot of mudir or mudira spaces, but you can slot onto a lot of excavations as a specialist. So she's put us around, and we went into the pot tent, and it was a nightmare, and I hated it so hard. With these broken pieces of shirt, I can't draw them. It took me hours to draw one. I was in tears. It was horrible. Hated everything about it. But the ceramicists were like, she has a clean hand. She can do this. And so Salima kept putting me in the pot tent. I didn't want to be in the pot tent. I wanted to survey. And I'd find increasingly, there were short seasons, 2 weeks, but I'd find a whole week of them. I'd be scheduled in pot tent. I'm like, what are you doing? Do you hate me? Why are we putting me here? And then after a couple of seasons of this, I started to get better. I started to be able to actually draw the things. I started to understand fabric analysis and what it was doing. It was late Roman ceramics. We're talking way out of my research or my interest at that time, maybe at this time. But I started seeing what we could do with them, and the questions lit me up. There's this abundance amount of material that nobody's a strong word, but people generally put into baskets and put over in the corner and pot person will deal with whatever. And it's just huge with social answers, just waiting to be investigated. And so at that point, suddenly I start asking for time in the pot tent. But it really is the North Kharga Oasis survey and Salima Akram that make me into a ceramicist. And then at Penn, I already had the training. So I'm like, well, it probably makes sense for me to do a ceramics PhD. This is what I want to do, but let's look at Old Kingdom data. And so started playing around. Dr. Miroslav Barta had been at Penn for a semester my first year. He's, of course, a huge name in Old Kingdom archaeology from the Charles University in Prague. And he had written an article on standardization of beer jars that I didn't fully agree with, but I totally, he's a great scholar, totally respect the scholar. So there's something there to play with, right? And I realized that I really wanted to deal with the tensions between local and central government. I wanted to think about people. This is the anthropologist in me. I want to figure out social reconstruction in human beings. And so I leaned on economy really hard as my research question, because economy is one way that a state can tie itself together. And at that time, remember, I started writing my dissertation in 2007. At that time, we're still teaching redistribution. We're thinking about big government. A lot of that is still being broken down now. But 2007, it's there, it's floating. We're still really thinking about a strong central power. And so I wanted to play with that. And that led me to more pots, and it led me to bread and beer, and it led me to Elephantine, where Dietrich Kraue was working and directing excavations, but let me have access to his material, which would provide another ongoing thread for my research. So I become a material culture person, really first and foremost as a ceramicist, and then as a dirt archaeologist doing excavation and directing excavation. But it's pots where my home is. So I currently work at 3 sites in Egypt, and let me just go chronologically for a second. My first excavation is in the Delta, in the eastern Nile Delta, under Don Redford, because everybody everybody seems to work under Don Redford at some point in their career, and I did it early. I was at Mendy's in 2001 as my first Egyptian experience. I had done some field work in the United States beforehand, and I strongly recommend that. The United States field work is excellent, good training. And then Salima took me on for the North Harga Oasis survey, where we were looking at 3,000 square kilometers. 3,000 square kilometers in an era before satellite imagery becomes really commonly available. And so we're doing a lot of ground survey. The whole thing is pretty unknown. Then I still stay grounded there, though I haven't been out for a while. Since 2014 was my last field season with them, which is an increasingly long time ago. Then I ended up moving to Elephantine, and that's where I actually, so my dissertation work was very deeply focused on two forms, beer jars and bread molds, and that provided a very focused research question and a very fundamental one. I continue to stand by that work. I love it. At heart, I'm a bread and beer girl. But moving to Elephantine happens when Johanna Ziegel out of the German Archaeological Institute becomes head of the Elephantine project. So it's a sub-project with DAI. And she's looking for a ceramicist, and I'm a ceramicist for hire. I will do your pots. And at that time, we thought we were going to get down to Old Kingdom layers, and it made a lot of sense to have the Old Kingdom girl with you. Turns out, so she brings me on, and two things happen that changed everything for me in some ways. One, we never get Old Kingdom layers. It just never happens. But fortunately, this comes back to, we have Middle Kingdom layers. And I was Joe Wegner's student. I had worked in Wassuit. I had done Middle Kingdom ceramics. Like, you get raised on Middle Kingdom ceramics at Penn. So it was totally in my wheelhouse. It was a place that I was comfortable being. I won't lie, if you give me late New Kingdom ceramics, I'm going to tell you, go find Pam Rose. Like, I'm not your girl. But that was still a comfortable place to be. So now I'm out of period, and my period of focus becomes much longer as a result. I do about 1,000 years old to middle them. And then settlement archaeology doesn't really allow for you to come in and be like, I'm just going to ask the economic question. That's all I'm going to do right now. I'm just going to limit my data extremely. And you can do that out of a published record. That's what I had done for my dissertation. You can do that when somebody else has control over the data and you know they're going to publish the rest of it, but you can dip in and handle some of it. That's how Dietz had to let me work with Elephantine material in 2009 for my diss. But now that I'm the ceramicist for the realities of life, I have to be morally obligated to all of these sherds. And it means suddenly my research agenda has to expand to deal with the sort of questions that those sherds pose for me. And so suddenly I'm dealing with huge amounts of data. In tandem with that, I keep working at Elephantine. I'm still on Elephantine. In tandem with my work at Elephantine, I started a project at Como Hessen and in 2016. And so I'm still on Elephantine, where that project continues to move forward today. I continue to be the head of ceramics group there. At the same time, started the excavation at Como Hessen in 2016 with the goal to reinvestigate the Old Kingdom settlement for two reasons. It's this in the literature from Robert Wenke in the 1980s. And remember, we're a strongly processualist moment in the 1980s. And he's an anthropologist, so we're really grounded in that worldview. We are getting a deeply state-tied model out of Como Hessen, and it's making it into all the literature, even though at that point, when I'm applying for permissions, Como Hessen hadn't been fully published. His excavation work had not been fully published, and has since been published. And so in the literature, it's like Como Hessen, redistributive economy, serving the state, raising cattle, look at pyramid building, how dominant it is. And everything I had worked with to that point suggested strongly that's the wrong way to view a provincial site in Egypt. That thinking about it as serving royal power and that being its end-all be-all, being that being its definition, is deeply problematic, that we should look at this in a much more complex way, that we should think about power as being points of tension, that we need to look at relationships with Libyans, we need to look at relationships through the Delta, and this was work waiting to happen. The other thing that's really obvious about Como Hessen, or was at that point, and it certainly has been in the excavations we've conducted, is that it doesn't stop at the Old Kingdom. it was a site through the Roman period. Now, the top parts of that comb were removed for construction of the Egyptian Light Railroad in the late 1800s, but this still leaves us with Old through Middle Kingdom stratigraphic record. And that transition had not been discussed. Like, what's going on? If we're going to say this is a supplier town, which I don't think it is, by the way, if we're going to say that, though, and it continues through the first intermediate period into the Middle Kingdom, what the heck is going on there? And if it's not, what's happening with regional identity? Either way, I want that continuity. And so knowing that that should exist in the record, I wanted to go back to it, which is where we are now, really. We'll be returning in a couple of weeks. It's a really interesting site. It's also a really challenging one to excavate. If you've been working at Abydos, if you've been working at Elephantine, where infrastructure is huge, there are houses, there are storerooms, and then you go to the Western Delta, where there is none of that. It becomes its own logistical challenge. And so that plus the superabundance of the ceramic record, in 3 weeks we got almost 2 metric tons of pottery. And remember that I'm the analyze all the sherds kind of girl. So you put all of that together, and it means that Comohism becomes this really unique challenge to work with. But we're starting to see now, the gap because of COVID, we're starting to see now the fruits of some of that come out in the analyses. That's exciting stuff. Getting a job is rough. I'm just not going to lie about that. As an Egyptologist, getting a job, we have better job prospects in my experience than like my husband, who's a Maya archaeologist or was trained that way. That's a rougher market, but the academic market's rough. And so when I was at Penn, I finished at 2010, and of course the market collapses a year or two before that. And so we're sort of in rough territory when one comes onto the job market. And several other Egyptologists graduate from Penn my year. But I had identified while I was at Penn a few things that are not research things, are not program things about myself. I had realized I really love people. I just really love people. Like, let me work with people. That works for an Egyptian archaeologist, because loving people and working closely with your people and speaking Arabic and hanging out helps your excavation get done, and it makes it so much more fun. So it works as a personality trait, as it turns out. And I didn't want to be at a big school where I had been raised in big schools, right? I was at Davis, 25,000 students, Penn, 11,000 graduate students, 11,000, 12,000 undergraduates, very big schools. I didn't want to be at a school where my relationship would be impersonal with my students, because I am so inherently personal and often very informal. And so I wanted to be in an environment where that could thrive. I also desperately wanted to be employed, because it turns out, I like paying my mortgage. And so I apply out of Penn, and the first job I get, and this is important to realize how I got to Roanoke College, the first job I got was at WVU Tech. And WVU, Institute of Technology, it was in Montgomery, West Virginia. We're talking southern West Virginia. It's in Beckley now. And I'm hired into the history department by Dr. Paul Rakes. We talk a lot about mentorship through graduate programs. We talk a lot about mentorship in our research, but mentorship in our work lives as we move into teaching, as you move into museums, as you move into any of these number of things that you might, is so crucial. I would not be where I am if it weren't for Paul Rakes. Because I would have been the Egyptologist I am, but I wouldn't be the teacher I am. I would not have been sort of engaged in the university in the way I am. And I had done a lot of service work at Penn, so I came in sort of knowing that leg of it. And Paul really mentored me through teaching. And after a couple of years, I realized West Virginia, WU Tech was not going to be the place I needed to stay. There's no growth opportunity there for me. And so I went back on the market, still with an eye towards small school, liberal arts college if I could, really keen on relationships. And a job at Roanoke College came up, and it was titled Assistant Professor of Art History and Archaeology. This is the job. This is the job I want, because we're dealing with, now I'm a material culture girl, but there's an overlap there in art history, right? Where you're dealing with objects, you're dealing with seeing, some things that are inherently, in some cases, very tactile. I get the privilege that art historians don't necessarily get, where I grab it with my bare hands all the time, right? but thinking about how to see, how to look, how to critically analyze a visual record. That's all stuff I had. And then they wanted an archaeologist as well with an active field project. These were the things they were looking for. Still in Appalachia, which is a region that's just absolutely beautiful, and so staying there. My husband loves mountains, and I'm relocating a couple, what will become a family. These are all concerns, and so I got the job, and that's what brought me to Roanoke College, is learning how to teach and knowing I wanted to connect with people, and that's what keeps me there at this point. I think a lot about how to teach and why it matters. And I'm lucky enough to have a job where I teach Egypt and archaeology. I teach the ancient Near East, the ancient Middle East. But I teach Africa, but I can stay largely in my wheelhouse. And so I realize a few things in doing that when I think about sort of a philosophy of teaching and why Egyptology is important in the classroom and how to communicate that to people. Relationships matter. Absolutely, unquestionably. I need to have relationships with my students. They need to have some sort of relationship with each other that makes a classroom a discussive space, a safe space. And discussion is how we can build ideas and really engage with things rather than just me talking at them. I also think it's really important for them to question. I don't want to say question the canon, that's so cliche. I want them to question received knowledge. I want them to bring their world and think about it critically. And so to realize a few things about ancient Egypt, that the ways they're learning to view ancient Egypt can sometimes be ways that they can learn to view themselves, right? But also, even more importantly, that when they're learning about ancient Egypt, they're learning about somebody who's different, that's not them, never strove to become them, isn't the bottom of a ladder that becomes them, is not white and European, is African, is relates into the modern Middle East, relates into modern Egypt, there's a real tie of landscape. This is all the stuff that I had at AUC, right? And so to get the students from the very beginning to think of the Egyptians as people, as not historical anomalies, but as human beings grounded in a physical space that also opens the door for the interest, power, and value of the modern Egypt. Because if ancient Egypt is valuable and interesting and grounded in its space, that opens the door to students thinking about modern Egypt, which is something that traditional students coming to study ancient Egypt don't do. They're surprised when I say things like Egypt's in Africa. They're like, what? I'm like, well, shall we visit a map? We could do that. Here you go. This is like non-contested fact right here. And when I'm like, let's talk about King Tut as a human being, they're like, he was a person. In fact, yes. How do you feel staring at a dead person versus a mummified object? How do we deal with that and think about human beings? And so the otherness and humanity are things I really want my kids to take away. I will not make a lot of Egyptologists in my career. I really hope I don't. I mean, I love the field, but there can't be a lot of us. It's just, unfortunately, at the PhD level. But there can be a lot of us who know the material, who love the material, who think critically about the material and touch base with it and consume it, whether it's in museums, whether it's through shows, whether it's by reading Elizabeth Peters, any of the number of things that they might do, whether they might just walk down the street and see an arrowhead and start to think about the value of place in analysis and culture. If they can take that away from my classroom, I've won. And I think I've actually had a bigger impact than my articles, which I hope everyone's reading because they're awesome, but read my articles. But in reality, it's the lives I've touched in the classroom that will probably continue to reverberate more strongly. So it's funny, right? You start a dissertation and you're like, can I write anything? Can I have a good thought? Can I make something original? And I finished my dissertation 13 years ago, and I'm at the point where I'm like, please, can we make the ideas stop coming? I don't have the time. I have a running list in my office. It's on a wall, and it says research to-dos. And it's a few things I need to edit, and I'm writing something. And then it's all the back burner projects, and it's embarrassing. I'm like, I need grad students because there needs to be somebody who gets these projects because I will die before I am finished with everything. And so research shifts, I love my bread and beer work. I have some experimental beer that's coming out. But that economy work, which is so foundational to how I think, and it is moving into a big, broader social reconstruction work. And some of that's because I think the economy work has laid grounds to think more broadly about society writ large, not just through one avenue, but through many. And some of it's because I'm a settlement archaeologist. I have a ridiculous amount of potsherds, like an appalling amount of data that needs to be sifted. And as I said, you don't get to control those research questions as well. You come at it with research questions, but then whether you are interested in cooking or not, that research question is so obviously there, suddenly my agenda expands. And so now I'm looking at daily life ways, I'm looking at regional relationships, I'm looking for regional differentiation, I'm doing a lot of cooking, and some experimental archaeology. I've reconstructed an ancient Egyptian beer, always going to be we're never going to quite get it right until we have an ancient yeast, but we're working through process. Have reconstructed an ancient Egyptian hearth to look at cooking patterns and things like that. And all of that bleeds out into my work. So sometimes I think people might look at my work and think I'm just dealing with pots, and it's like, no, I'm a social archaeologist. That's really how I define myself. Pottery is my tool to get at it, because it turns out everyone uses pottery in the same way everybody uses cups, in the same way that everyone uses, the Tupperware containers. And so it's fundamental to our lives. So I can say excitingly fundamental things, which we haven't bothered investigating about the Egyptians often, right? I want to know the basics of their lives so we can actually understand all the other stuff that we've been so interested in studying, cult and kingship. That comes after you can eat. Right? And so I want to get that. And so it still comes together in this package of regional and local power, but I'm looking at it through a diversity of lenses because I just have such a huge amount of data that has to get out. I have an ethical obligation to get my data out. And so the bigger social analysis, I have this dream of a statewide, I have a 3rd millennium BC book in me. It's waiting. It's drafted. I have an outline, but it's going to wait a little bit longer while I solidify these pieces of daily life, regional interactions, regional or local identities. Pottery, it looks the same. It's not the same. So ways to view that and then fold that into the analysis. So that's where I am now. It's an exciting place because it's constantly evolving. There's no lack of work to be done. That's always going to be the truth. The future of Egyptology, and in this I'm going to be specific to Egyptian archaeology, I think looks inherently interdisciplinary. And we've seen that as we have to reach into the sciences to do more scientific analyses. They're hard in Egypt, but the ministry has just opened up labs to enable some of those scientific analyses. So we're going to have to look more interdisciplinary. We're going to have to look more to anthropology. I think seeing ASOR, the American Schools of Overseas Research, start to branch out and include more Egypt, seeing more Egyptologists go to the SAA, as the Society of American Archaeology. We're thinking about the field in a bigger way, rather as our little niche, where we're talking to ourselves, which is fun, don't get me wrong, but is very limited, right? It's too small an audience, it's too small a way to think. I think technology is changing us in that it's empowering new analyses. It's not replacing old analyses, it's just empowering new. And so I think I'm working on a project with Infosol that really branches out into a digital archaeology sphere where we're analyzing ceramics through a business intelligence mode. I suspect that more stuff like that will happen in the field. And I think more Egyptologists will have to learn how to be cross-trained in teaching, because those big Egyptology jobs, the ones that were trained from the Penns, the Chicagos, the Yales, the UCLAs, don't hire a lot of people. They make far more people than they hire. And so inherently, if we want jobs, we're going to have to think jobs in the academy, which is a struggle. Anyway, the academy is a struggle. We're going to have to think more creatively about how we approach the record and sell ourselves. And so that interdisciplinarity helps, right? Because you can go and then teach interdisciplinarily. I think that's where we're going, which is a really exciting future, but I think there's going to be a lot of change.